In 1540, Ignatius Loyola founds a new order known as the Jesuits. He recruits the best, brightest, and most highly dedicated to join his ranks. Their missionary zeal makes them one of the most potent forces in the history of Christianity. Their mission is to revive the Catholic Church in this time of Reformation. They are asked to start a school in a small Sicilian town, and within decades, Jesuit schools are in demand all over Europe. Jesuits are soon highly influential wherever they go. As the 16th century draws to a close, not only is the advance of the Protestants stopped, but a significant portion of Europe reformed by the Protestants is won back to the Catholic Church, due largely to the efforts of the Jesuits.
There were people who thought, well, the Protestants have gone too far. They've thrown away the baby with the bath. One finds a period of great enthusiasm, followed by a period of second thoughts, followed even by a period of retrenchment.
Not all are converted by the word, however. Many are forced to convert by the sword. Wars erupt all over Europe between Protestant and Catholic over which faith shall prevail.
The dominant notion is that the unity and peace and tranquility of society depends on a common faith. That's the glue that holds society together. And therefore, when somebody is attacking and undermining the stability of society, that is certainly going to provoke, if all other solutions fail, certainly going to provoke attempts at violent solution.
It is a time when civilization is based on one ruler, one faith. A time when the notion of many faiths under the same rule is still centuries away.
It's a sorry thing to say, but I'm afraid if you want to know what the human race really thinks, what they really believe in, you have to ask what they're willing to kill for. And in this case, they were willing to kill for the unity of Christendom. I mean, it just sounds awful when I say it. It is awful when I say it.
For more than 100 years, Europe convulses in wars of religion, as Christian slaughters Christian in the name of God.
But the wars of religion are civil wars. So you have to imagine doing this to your own country. They were basically self-inflicted devastation.
The wars end for little else than pure exhaustion. By 1650, a war-torn, weary Europe remains divided by faith. But Christianity's physical and spiritual exhaustion is countered by the growing influence of Loyola and his Jesuit missionaries. The Church of Rome is about to make one of the most profound changes in the last half of its second millennium. Christianity is going to travel beyond Europe and to the rest of the world. In the early 16th century, the Protestant Reformation, led by Martin Luther, forever tears the already divided fabric of Christianity. It is the dawn of a fierce and bloody rivalry between Catholics and Protestants. As bold new visions of Christianity are introduced in Western Europe, yet two of the West's greatest powers, Spain and Portugal, remain remarkably undisturbed by these struggles. Instead, they embark on an amazing endeavor to spread Christianity around the entire globe.
16th century is a turn point in Christian history. It's a turn point for two reasons. One is the Reformation, and the other is the tremendous expansion that takes place at that time.
The printing press had helped fuel the Protestant Reformation within Europe. Now another innovation will take Christianity beyond Europe's shores. Nimble, three-masted Portuguese sailing ships will enable travelers to go where they've never gone before, to unknown ends and new worlds. It is the age of exploration. For the first time in their history, Europeans sail the world, and wherever they go, whatever they explore, they bring with them the faith of Europe, Christianity. Africa, Asia, the Americas. In little more than 150 years, Western Europeans more than triple the size of their Christian realm. However, Christian explorers bring more than just their faith. They also bring a profound sense of cultural superiority and a lust for wealth. And so it is that Spanish conquistadors arrive in the New World. Often ruthless and brutal, their actions lead to the decimation of entire native cultures.
The Spanish conquest of the Western Hemisphere shows some of the worst depth to which Christianity can lower itself. The atrocities that were committed in the name of Christianity were enormous, and there's no way to deny those.
These ancient structures in central Mexico are all that remain today of a once mighty civilization called the Aztecs. Nearly 5 centuries ago, the Aztecs came face to face with cruel destiny in the man who would destroy them, a Spaniard named Hernán Cortés. Like many of his fellow conquistadors, Cortés is a devout Christian. He prays faithfully, attends Mass, and wells up with tears when confessing his sins.
He was a very sincere Christian who also was a thief and a murderer, and who thought he was doing that in the service of God.
Cortés heads straight to Tenochtitlan, capital city of the Aztecs. Those natives who do not die from imported European disease succumb to Spanish swords. It is the beginning of European colonies that convert and enslave the indigenous people, and the end of Aztec civilization. The conquerors of this new world establish an institution that will be a fierce battleground in Christianity for centuries to come: slavery. In the 16th century, slavery, which had dated back to ancient times, is still a common practice in many European countries, particularly in Portugal and Spain. Unknown in the New World, the Spanish conquistadors now make it practically universal. Almost all Europeans in the New World enslave natives, but occasionally a voice is raised in protest. Foremost among them is a Dominican friar named Bartolomé de las Casas. When de las Casas sails for the New World in the early 16th century, he witnesses natives being worked to death, or branded, roasted, and eaten by dogs. The situation leaves the friar appalled.
Everything done to the Indians thus far was unjust and tyrannical. Bartolomé de las Casas, 1514.
Bartolomé de las Casas was a man who himself had had Indians given to him to work for him, and who then became convinced that this was wrong, and he let go of his Indians, and he spent the whole rest of his life trying to get things changed.
De las Casas proposes an alternative to enslaving the natives. To bring in needed labor, he recommends importing slaves from the continent the Portuguese first explored, Africa. For the Europeans, slaves from Africa do not pose the same moral problem as native slaves in the New World. This, they rationalize, because Africans have supposedly been captured in defensive or just wars between tribes.
A just war is one in which the war takes place, again, for good reason, to defend oneself and one's society against unprovoked attack from others. Now, eventually, you begin to have people, including Las Casas, say, wait a minute, there's so many of these people, could they all be captured in just war? And, of course, the answer that is supported by the economics of it is, well, of course they're captured in just war.
African slaves begin to flood into the New World, first in the thousands, then tens of thousands, and ultimately millions. The churches of Spain, Portugal, France, England, and the American colonies look on silently as the traffic in African slaves grows. Bartolomé de las Casas, who first proposed the idea, lives to regret suggesting importing African slaves, seeing it as a horrible mistake. He now recommits himself to banning all slavery in the New World. Despite remarkable legal success in Spain, the laws prove unenforceable across the Atlantic. With the passage of time, African slaves and natives in the New World absorb the faith of Christianity and give it new forms of expression that resonate throughout the world, even back to Rome itself. But with time comes change, and with change, uncertainty, and with uncertainty, fear. Changes now coming in science cause the church to retreat from the modern world. It is a retreat that will threaten the very foundations of Christianity. From the dawn of time, human beings have gazed up at the heavens and wondered what answers to life's questions might lie among the stars. In the blink of history's eye, just 20 years after Martin Luther's protest and the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs, an astronomer in Poland makes an astounding claim. It is not the sun that moves around the earth, but the earth that moves around the sun. The astronomer's name is Nicolaus Copernicus. At first, the Catholic Church supports Copernicus.
Well, just recently there's a lot of work showing that, for example, a lot of the stuff in astronomy was done on behalf of the church. So all of a sudden you've got people in cathedrals, and it's for actually ecclesiastical purposes that they are taking out these experiments. So at first, the church not only embraces them, but actually sponsors them.
But scientific progress also seems to perplex the Church. In 1615, barely 70 years after Copernicus first announced his startling discovery, the Church completely reverses its position and places the writings of Copernicus on its index of prohibited books. In making this abrupt turnaround, the Church appears to be retreating into dogma in the face of scientific advance.
Copernicus has already been dead, something like 70 years. So the question is, why is he initially patronized, say, by the Pope, by local bishops, and condemned way after he's dead? And I think it has a lot less to do with Copernicus than with the fact that the world itself had changed.
A changing world that causes a church to move fitfully backward and then forward as it responds to scientific progress and the growth of Protestantism. By the 17th century, the Catholic Church is sharply resisting any challenge to its authority. And thus, the stage is set for one of the most famous conflicts between science and religion. At its center is a brilliant and headstrong astronomer named Galileo. Having built a powerful telescope, Galileo sees the planets with unprecedented clarity. He concludes that Copernicus was right. The Earth does indeed revolve around the sun. Galileo's publications immediately attract the attention of the Inquisition. Despite being a practicing Catholic and a friend of the Pope, he is tried for heresy in 1632.
Take note, theologians, that in your desire to make matters of faith out of propositions relating to the fixity of sun and earth, you run the risk of eventually having to condemn as heretics those who would declare the earth to stand still and the sun to change position. Galileo, the Dialogue.
Although his life is spared, he is forced to recant his theory and remains silent on the subject for the remainder of his days. The Catholic Church continues to struggle with scientific advance, seemingly unable to reconcile empirical knowledge with church doctrine or even Scripture itself. But new advances in human knowledge prove unstoppable. Just as the best young minds once turned to theology, they now turn to science and technology.
By the time the scientific revolution has really taken hold, about 1650s, you've switched your whole frame of reference. People aren't going to spend most of their intellectual energy now on theological issues. They've moved to science in a kind of permanent way.
On the heels of scientific discovery, now comes another revolution, signaled by the thunder of machines. The Industrial Revolution. '18th century England. Hundreds of thousands abandoned villages for newly created jobs in the cities. This huge upheaval creates a hunger for religious meaning in a material world. The response comes from an unlikely source. As a young man, John Wesley studies theology at Oxford and then enters the ministry because, in his own words, his father tells him to do so. 10 years pass before Wesley joins a mission to America, to the state of Georgia. But he seems a faithless man, bringing faith to the New World. His trip is not successful, as he himself writes when he returns to England.
I went to America to convert Indians, but oh, who shall convert me? I, who went to America to convert others, was never myself converted to God. John Wesley.
On Wednesday, May 24th, 1738, John Wesley finds himself in a meeting of a religious society on London's Aldersgate Street. As someone reads from the works of Martin Luther, Wesley suddenly experiences a profound change.
About 9:15, while he was describing the change which God works in the heart through faith in Christ, I felt my heart strangely warmed. I felt I did trust in Christ alone for salvation, and an assurance was given me that he had taken away my sins, even mine, and saved me from the law of sin and death. John Wesley.
And so, John Wesley finally finds the faith which he had once tried to bring to the New World. He takes his newfound spirit directly to the people of England, particularly the poor, who do not attend church regularly. As a modern, more egalitarian era dawns, Wesley's ideas feel in step with the times. He has created an ethic which, on the individual level, aims to avoid harm, and on the communal level, is mindful of the public good. Finding it necessary to formulate a set of regulations for his followers, Wesley draws up the General Rules in 1743. In the General Rules, Wesley prescribes a clear method for salvation, summed up in 3 ideas. Do no harm, do good, and attend all the ordinances of God. Wesley's rules are a virtual method by which every individual can follow his or her spiritual journey. His followers become known as Methodists.
His was a modern form of spirituality because he promoted method. That's why the Methodists got their name. That if you were sort of systematic, as you were in science, about your Christianity, then you'd bring out a real Christian at the end of it. And so it was shedding off the layers of doctrinal controversy in an attempt to go beneath that to the core of emotion that subsists at the heart of Christianity.
Until then, Christian leaders had always argued. Aquinas argued, Calvin argued, Luther argued. These people didn't argue. They didn't make an appeal to constructive reason. They made an appeal, a direct, intuitive appeal to the minds and hearts of ordinary people.
To find those minds and hearts, Wesley does not need a church. For him, any place he preaches, a backyard, a town square, an open field, even a tavern, is a place of worship. He preaches in all kinds of weather, rain or shine, by day and by moonlight. This is the beginning of the modern-day evangelical and the birth of the revival meeting. The revival meeting proves an astonishingly popular form and adapts particularly well to the frontiers and wilderness of the North American colonies. And thus, revivals, evangelism, and Methodism itself migrate to the New World and succeed where once John Wesley himself had failed. One of Wesley's colleagues, however, will have tremendous success bringing Methodism to this fertile ground. His name is George Whitefield. What he lacks in Wesley's organizational skills, he more than makes up for in the sheer force of his oration.
George Whitefield was simply spectacular. He was trained in drama. People would sometimes say that George Whitefield could put a congregation in tears by the way he pronounced the word Mesopotamia.
Whitefield has an additional skill that marks him as a modern evangelical. He knows the power of publicity.
Sometimes we think of 20th century preachers as media people, but it's been argued recently that George Whitefield was the first of them. When he comes into town, they had already built up an air of expectation. He would come in and speak. I almost imagine it being like Billy Graham coming in on a helicopter or something.
Whitfield's preaching tours take the North American colonies by storm. Beginning in 1740 and lasting little more than 2 years, big tent revival meetings burst out all over the colonies. This is the Great Awakening. It is one of the most electrifying surges of godliness in the history of the colonies. The Great Awakening marks the beginning of the evangelical tradition in North America. It is markedly egalitarian, and because of this, mirrors the emerging split between the old world and the new.
It is the first intercolonial incident, and if you were, as Whitfield would be in South Carolina, taking on the Anglican establishment, and then going to New England and speaking at Harvard, all of a sudden you get that sense that we're all in the same plot. You have to remember that the Great Awakening, which was really a movement of fervor, of enthusiasm was the word they often used, was subversive.
Thus, the Great Awakening stirs the first awareness of a shared identity in the colonies, and perhaps a shared destiny. Before the century is over, the North American colonies will revolt. The new country that results will be among the most religiously tolerant nations in the Western world. It will also be one of the most Christian. The first Puritans to arrive on the shores of the New World were fleeing religious persecution in England. These Puritans were not Anglican or Catholic. They were followers of John Calvin, and they first arrived in the colonies in 1607. As followers of Calvin, they came with the hope to build a Christian city of God. They were lured to this new world wilderness by the awesome potential of the blank slate that was the land before them.
There is this sense of the New World as God's new Israel. The idea here was that this was to be a vanguard for setting up a kind of model city, the kingdom of God across the Atlantic. The hope was that you would have this light to the world, a beacon to England. England would invite the Puritan ministers back, and that island would be reformed, and the reform would spread to Europe and to the rest of the world.
The Puritans had no interest in creating a religiously tolerant society in the New World. To the contrary, the Puritans saw dissent as a threat to their civilization and their holy city. Subsequent European settlements in the North American colonies were established with the same lack of religious tolerance. Each sect had its own territory. The Atlantic coast soon became a tapestry of Christian faiths. By the year 1700, the Puritans were in Massachusetts and Connecticut. Presbyterians occupied Long Island. Lutherans were along the Delaware River. Anglicans were in Virginia. And there was even a small Catholic settlement in Maryland. Now, in the early 17th century, two men are about to steer the New World away from religious intolerance. One is Roger Williams. In England, Williams is one of only 8 students given a scholarship to Cambridge University for his knowledge of Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. He is also already controversial for his ideas on freedom of worship. Williams soon sets sail for the New World, where he arrives on February 5th, 1631. He preaches at Salem and Plymouth, but his liberal views almost get him deported. for the New World is not yet a place of religious tolerance.
Enforced uniformity confounds civil and religious liberty and denies the principles of Christianity and civility. That cannot be a true religion which needs carnal weapons to uphold it. No man shall be required to worship or maintain a worship against his will. Roger Williams.
Williams flees Salem and Plymouth, walking 60 miles south in the dead of winter to the headwaters of Narragansett Bay. Here, he founds his own colony in present-day Rhode Island. He names it Providence, which means under the benevolent care of God.
Roger Williams would have nothing to do with the idea of establishment. In fact, one time he hauled down the English flag and cut the cross out of it, just literally cut the cross out, because he thought that Jesus' kingdom should have nothing to do with the King of England.
In 1682, another Englishman leaves for the New World with visions of a new society based on wider freedoms than those in Europe. His name is William Penn, and his followers are the Quakers. Out of respect for Penn's late father, King Charles II gives Penn a huge tract of land in North America and named it, in his father's honor, Pennsylvania, or Penn's Woods. Penn appoints himself governor and drafts an astonishingly inclusive constitution. Like Roger Williams, Penn allows for unprecedented freedom of worship to anyone who accepts the monotheistic principle of one God.
I do hereby declare that no person who shall confess one Almighty God shall be in any case molested or prejudiced because of his conscientious persuasion or practice. Pennsylvania's frame of government.
Penn's vision attracts settlers of all faiths. It is now that its capital, Philadelphia, becomes known as the city of brotherly love.
A big part of their ethos was to make room for all kinds of people to come to their city of brotherly love, Philadelphia, and environs. And so Pennsylvania soon became a refuge for all kinds of people, including from the continent.
April 19th, 1775. Dawn breaks on the village common of Lexington, Massachusetts. A ragtag group called Minutemen stare down the barrels of their muskets, anxiously awaiting the advancing British redcoats. Within moments, the battle erupts with a hail of bullets and bayonets. This is history at a pivotal turning point, world history and Christian history. It is the start of America's War of Independence and will also mark the beginning of a new era in which church and state are separate and all faiths have equal rights under one government. On October 19th, 1781, British General Charles Cornwallis surrenders to General George Washington at Yorktown. Although not clear in this moment, America's War of Independence is over. 10 years later, in 1791, the new country's leaders compose its Constitution. It is now that the social models of Roger Williams' Providence and William Penn's Pennsylvania have a profound influence. Throughout the land, there will be the freedom to practice all religions.
Religious freedom was different and a step beyond toleration. So the Anglican Church, for example, in England, could tolerate other religions, but it wasn't the same as the true church. Now, religious freedom went beyond that because it wasn't a question of the state saying this is normative religion and the others, well, you know, we'll tolerate them.
Paradoxically, the decision to take religion out of government produces one of the most religious and Christian nations in the world.
It fosters a situation in which religious entrepreneurs can vie for the hearts of religious people. It fosters an explosion of different kinds of religion. It's an extremely hospitable place for religion. It's the great marketplace of religion.
In a nation that already has so many faiths, they clearly cannot single out any one without plunging their new country into the same kind of religious wars that have so often devastated Europe. The drafters have little choice but to protect all religions. This protection becomes a cherished cornerstone of one of the nation's most important documents, the Bill of Rights.
Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. First Amendment, U.S. Bill of Rights.
America is the first to divide church and state, and it becomes a model for the world. Within just a few years, one of the most powerful nations in Europe will follow young America's example. But France's endeavor to separate church from state will be one of the bloodiest in modern history. The French Revolution is about to arrive at the gates of the Bastille and the great doors of Notre Dame. Today, the Cathedral of Notre Dame is a world-famous monument. It stands on the River Seine in modern-day Paris, a living testament to the grandeur of a faith. But little more than 200 years ago, a very strange and decidedly unholy ritual took place here, just as France was ushering in the modern age. The date is November 10th, 1793. It is the height of the French Revolution, a revolution which is proving much more than an uprising of the people against unjust rule. For this revolution is also a revolt against the excesses of the Catholic Church. Inside the ancient Cathedral of Notre Dame, a strange pageant is underway. At the altar stands not a priest, but a prostitute. She has been plucked off the street and is now hailed by revolutionaries as the goddess of reason. The sacred cathedral has been renamed the Temple of Reason. The pageant is a celebration of the new values of France and a mocking repudiation of the Catholic Church.
If you have a motto of, it was écraser l'infâme, crush the infamous thing, which was the church religion, and you put a statue of reason on the altar in Notre Dame, you've gone a long way toward saying religion is something backward and counterproductive in more modern terms.
Priests are commanded to abandon their allegiance to the Pope. Church services are discontinued, and churches themselves are closed. Above all, the French Revolution nationalizes the true wealth of the Church. This is its land, the vast properties that surround the monasteries. It has been amassed over centuries. By 1790, this property amounts to almost 1/10 of all the land in France. Now, it is confiscated and sold to fund the revolution.
So all the great real estate in France was monastic. And you have a French Revolution because you want to get rid of monasteries, and you want to do away with all of these economic ties. This spells the end of that kind of institutional Christianity or Christendom that goes way back in the very earliest Middle Ages.
The crowning blow to the Catholic Church is yet to come. This occurs in the year 1798, when the French army marches into Rome and extorts a huge protection fee from the Pope, Pius VI. Then, on February 20th, a young general by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte has the Pope taken prisoner. Already old and frail, the shock of imprisonment causes the Pope to become gravely ill. Nevertheless, Pius clings to life for more than a year. Finally, he is dragged to a small town in France. There, in 1799, as the 18th century draws to a close, in an abandoned structure that was once a sheep pen, Pope Pius VI expires. The death of this pope is generally seen by the observant as the end of the spiritual empire he had ruled so long. But this funeral of Christianity is interrupted by a most unexpected incident. Pius VI seems to reach out from his grave, or as C.K. Chesterton, a leading writer, would observe a century later, the Pope's corpse came to life. It turns out that Pius has completed secret instructions for his successor before he died. In less than a year, the papacy rises from the ashes. A new pope reestablishes himself as ruler of church territories and as its supreme authority. Nevertheless, as the 19th century dawns, and with it the modern era, the church finds itself reacting rather than acting in a post-American and French revolutionary society, in a newborn modern world.
The long-term effect is that Catholicism becomes rabidly anti-republican. Anti-republican in the sense that it's against this leveling, this democratic leveling, where you and I are citizens. We are not members of a caste, but we're equals. And this is a real problem for Catholicism because it becomes reactionary all the way from the reestablishment. Well, very long. Till about 1965, actually.
From Leeds to London, and from Boston to Birmingham, the Industrial Revolution arrives amid the thundering clamor of giant machines. Whole populations shift from farms to cities. The world becomes a more literal place, preoccupied with the pace of change. Concerns of the spirit are often left behind. Reacting to a world emerging in the modern era, the Catholic Church now comes up with one of its most controversial decrees. The year is 1869. The place is Rome. The event is the First Vatican Council, and the result is the doctrine of papal infallibility. The Catholic Church, also known as the spouse of Christ, says that in matters of faith and morals, the Pope never makes a mistake.
The doctrine of faith which God has revealed has not been proposed as a philosophical discovery to be improved upon by human talent, but has been committed as a divine deposit to the spouse of Christ to be faithfully guarded and infallibly interpreted by her. Vatican Council, Session 3, Chapter 4.
In the exact words of the Catholic Encyclopedia,
we mean, in other words, that the Church is infallible in her objective, definitive teaching regarding faith and morals.
The authority for this, the Church says, comes from the Gospel of Matthew.
All power is given to me in heaven and in earth. Going therefore, teach ye all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you all days, even to the consummation of the world. Matthew 28:18.
The doctrine of papal infallibility is the work of two deeply conservative popes, Gregory XVI and Pius IX.
Pius IX and Gregory condemn unilaterally most of the things that we hold dear. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly. And in one of Pius IX's great lines to a bunch of pilgrims at Lourdes, that insidious plague of modernity, universal suffrage.
The doctrine of papal infallibility is not born easily. Many bishops argue over the timing, and others over the substance. The debate is heated, to say the least.
Some speakers give one the impression they speak with their fist clenched or with their finger on the trigger of a revolver. From a private letter by the Bishop of Nancy.
As the First Vatican Council follows its stormy path, the country all around, Italy, is on the verge of becoming a unified nation. Pius IX can only stand by in horror as soldiers fighting for the unification seize his papal states. These are lands that have been ruled by the Pope since the Middle Ages. Lacking an army or protectors, the Pope is helpless. It is no coincidence that the doctrine of papal infallibility, a declaration of the Pope's supreme power, comes at the exact time when Pius IX is brought to a final surrender.
He's not going to be a big political player anymore. He has no temporal power. Well, a pope without temporal power is sort of not a pope, at least not an old pope.
It is the loss of its territory that marks the beginning of a new and modern church. In an ever more material world, the church now focuses on the boundless realm of the Spirit. Freed from the burden of ruling vast properties, the popes of the modern era will devote all of their energies to the spiritual leadership of the Catholic Church. And so it is that the American and French revolutions help mark the last rites for medieval ways and a turning point for Christianity. What lies ahead is the ascendance of the Protestants. For the first time, they will send their own missionaries all over the world. Armed with technology and brimming with confidence, these modern Protestant missionaries will shift the very balance of Christianity and free native populations everywhere for the worship of Christ. It is the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution thunders on, bringing with it the modern age. In Europe, the Church of Rome has retreated, taking a largely reactionary stance in the face of science, technology, and global commerce. Yet in the rest of the world, the 19th century will see the greatest expansion in Christianity since the age of the explorers. This is the second great wave of missionaries. The first wave, in the 16th century, was led by Loyola and his Catholic Jesuits. This new wave of missionaries is Protestant. They bring with them their powerful message of an accessible God. In contrast with Catholics, the Protestants embrace technology, trade, and new values.
The Protestant church had less problems with modernity than the Catholic Church did. So it was easier for the Protestant church to go places and say, we're bringing democracy, we're bringing free enterprise, we're bringing freedom of speech, freedom of thought, the Bible, Protestant doctrine, and mix all that together in one bundle that somehow made sense.
By the end of the 19th century, mission outposts will stretch from Africa to Asia to Latin America. The missionaries themselves, who are strictly volunteers, exude supreme optimism. These missionaries are not just clergy, but ordinary Protestants, including married couples, families, and sometimes entire communities. For the first time, women are directly involved. It is an opportunity for them to be at once respectable, wildly adventurous, and effective.
Women missionaries, they were often more influential than men because they could influence children and work with women in domestic situations. And because they didn't tend to fulminate and preach and stand on the street corner and talk about how hell was going to open up and all the heathens were going to drop down, that they saw themselves more as teachers than preachers, and understandably that was often better received.
As the missionary movement matures, its Protestant ideals mix increasingly with a more insistent force, business. And so it is that the missionaries' movement is intertwined with colonialism. The missions become inseparable from the expanding Western empires and their seemingly insatiable desire for profit.
The 19th century Protestant missionary movement backs up the colonialists. It's seen as the other arm of colonialism, a way of civilizing the natives, but also helping them to subject themselves to Western hegemony.
Some of the missionaries are strongly opposed to colonialism, and especially the commerce that comes with it. Others view business as a necessary evil. But one missionary, perhaps the best known of all modern missionaries, takes an altogether different stance. He believes so fervently in the benefits of business that he makes it his battle cry.
I go to Africa to try to make an open path for commerce and Christianity. Do you carry on the work that I have begun?
He saw that his great mission was as a missionary general, blazing the path whereby others can follow.
David Livingstone is a devoutly religious man. He is also very much a person of his times, industrious, scientific, and a man of medicine. He is dispatched to a mission in southern Africa. As the European and American colonists probe deeper into the African continent, one form of trade, the trade in human beings, expands. For David Livingstone and other missionaries, this poses a true problem. On the one hand, colonialism brings to native peoples the benefits of modern civilization and the message of Christianity. On the other hand, the Christian connection to colonialism and the resulting slavery cannot be denied. Livingstone searches for an answer.
The people are so anxious to get a little of our goods that in return for them, they part not with their own children, but with children kidnapped from other tribes. If we can supply the people with our goods for lawful commerce, I think we have a fair prospect of putting a stop to the slave trade in a very large part of the country.
He really exposed that now the interior of Africa was providing the slaves, and the way to combat that was Christianity, commerce, civilization. And the way to do that was to lead an expedition up the great rivers of Africa, and there in this new land which he had found, there you could have civilization.
Livingstone would go on to discover the Zambezi River and lead a missionary expedition deep into Africa's heart. Eventually, he would succumb to disease and die among the natives. He would not live to see slavery in Africa end. Perhaps the missionaries' Christian message traveled with the slaves from Africa to the New World. Perhaps the transplanted Africans took on the faith of their new land. In the end, Christianity among American slaves would eventually come to emerge as a powerful uniting force in their struggle for freedom and equality. From Africa to America and beyond, Christianity's global development continues as thousands are inspired to join the missions by the remarkable example of David Livingstone and others. Soon there are tens of thousands of Protestant missionaries preaching in almost every country throughout the world. However, despite the ambition and energy of these missions, there are surprisingly few conversions. Permeating the missionary movement is an attitude of cultural superiority. It proves deeply alienating.
You really had a confidence that we had a superior civilization. We had a right and a calling to make that world more attractive and to win people. And with them came many benign things, medicine, education, and so on. But the assumption was that we must take over.
The scene of Christianity's evolution now shifts to a fledgling community around the Great Salt Lake in the American territory of Utah. A group of people has settled in this wilderness to follow their own beliefs. They are all members of a new church called the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Their faith is born in response to the multiplicity of Christian sects and the shifting values of the modern world. They are known as the Mormons.
One of the things that attracted people to Mormonism was that it closed itself off from society because it believed that society was essentially going to hell, literally. That in a very short period of time, God would destroy the world as we knew it and would reestablish the kingdom of God on earth, which they referred to specifically as Zion.
The Mormons are characterized by their abstinence from tea, coffee, tobacco, and alcohol, and controversial for their practice of polygamy. All members' incomes are tithed, which propels the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to power and wealth. By the end of the 19th century, Mormons number more than 250,000 people and are growing rapidly. The future will see the Mormon faith spread to more than 150 countries throughout the world. As the 20th century dawns, the Catholic Church also reacts to the rapid growth of Christian denominations and the changing cultural landscape of the modern world. The year is 1907. The place is Rome. The Church lashes out against modernism as Pope Pius X issues an encyclical called Pascendi. In it, the Church condemns modernism and points to its dangers. But the decree goes even further, establishing a procedure that has an ominous resonance.
We decree, therefore, that in every diocese a council of this kind, which we are pleased to name the Council of Vigilance, be instituted without delay. They shall be bound to secrecy as to their deliberations and decisions, and in their functions shall be included the following. They shall watch most carefully for every trace and sign of modernism, both in publications and in teaching, and to preserve the clergy and the young from it. They shall take all prudent, prompt, and efficacious measures. Pope Pius X on the Doctrine of the Modernists, September 8, 1907.
In attempting to turn away from modernism, the Church sows discord from within, as many Catholic clerics strongly oppose Pope Pius. This marks the beginning of an ever-widening rift between conservative and liberal Catholics in the 20th century. But the thunder of factories and the roar of daily life that greet the 20th century will overwhelm many, not just the Church of Rome. Christian leaders strive to make the voice of God heard above the noise and distraction. A deep yearning emerges for a faith that feels simple and accessible.
We have to realize that for many people throughout the world, modern society is deeply threatening and arouses many profound fears. It's threatening ideas that seem to undermine fundamental attributes of the faith, such as some of the scientific discoveries about the creation of the world, for example, seems to make faith impossible for people.
Once again, history's stage is set for reform. Once again, Christianity will renew itself. This time, renewal comes with a return to the traditional, a return to the origin, a return to the fundamentals, and in a way that no one could have anticipated. In a world of increasing speed, growth, and money, there seems to be less and less of a place for God. And yet, Christianity in the 19th and 20th centuries proves to have an astonishingly dynamic life. That life is powerfully demonstrated in an energetic young country, America. All across this new land, big tent Christian gatherings have taken place in the 18th and 19th centuries. They now give way to revival meetings, evangelical meetings. Led by charismatic leaders such as Billy Sunday, evangelists are distinguished by their streamlined message of belief in Jesus. On the exact dawn of the 20th century, January 1st, 1901, a prayer group is gathered in Topeka, Kansas. Suddenly, a woman begins speaking in unknown tongues. This marks the beginning of the Pentecostal movement, so named in commemoration of the original Pentecost, when just weeks after the death of Jesus, people also began speaking in unknown tongues. The Pentecostals are defined by a deeply personal connection with God that comes directly through the Holy Spirit, the divine presence within. This is typically expressed by the speaking in tongues, which may be a reaction to a babble of new information in an ever more complex world.
Pentecostalism answered a real need against the complexity of modern discourse. The speaking in tongues, for example, was giving the common, ordinary people who felt excluded from the sophisticated discourse of their time a voice, and was an attempt to capture Christianity back from the learned theologians who were making it so complicated that nobody could understand it.
Some 10 years after the rise of Pentecostals, another group of Protestants emerges. These are the fundamentalists. Their name is descriptive, for these people stress the fundamentals of the Bible, essentially believing that the Bible is factually and literally true. In 1925, the fundamentalists clash head-on with the modern world. In Dayton, Tennessee, a young school teacher named John Scopes is charged with teaching the theory of evolution. The courtroom becomes a public confrontation of fundamentalist versus modern views.
Leaders came along who gathered up discontents and said, there's a conspiracy against us. They've taken away our country, and we must win it back, so we have to fight.
The so-called Scopes monkey trial attracts nationwide publicity, and even though Scopes is convicted, the fundamentalists are portrayed as country hicks and zealots who are stubbornly clinging to outdated beliefs. Mocked and humiliated, they retreat to their inner circles. But Christianity's progress continues on its often unpredictable path. The same fundamentalists on retreat from modern science and evolution now embrace the most modern of tools. First radio, then television. Both of these innovations will have a major impact on evangelism. In 1922, an effervescent young woman is escorted into an Oakland, California radio station. She finds herself in a strange world filled with glowing vacuum tubes, humming electrical transformers, and a small studio audience. Meanwhile, in the comfort of their homes, thousands of listeners anxiously await the start of her message. When she starts to speak into the microphone, Amy Semple McPherson becomes the first woman in history to preach a sermon over the so-called wireless telephone. McPherson and her International Church of the Foursquare Gospel become a fixture of American fundamentalism, mixing performance and music in church services that attract a massive following.
They created their own broadcasting networks, their own Bible institutes, their own schools, their own churches, and formed a sort of counterculture.
The arrival of television in the 1940s enables yet another key figure in American fundamentalism to rise to national popularity. He is Billy Graham, perhaps the most famous and enduring of the evangelicals. As it turns out, the medium suits the man.
We thought we could get along without God. We thought we could get along without a moral standard. We thought we could get along without the Ten Commandments and the Sermon on the Mount. And we're beginning to wake up to the fact that we can't.
He was one of the first evangelists to take advantage of television, and one of the reasons he may have succeeded was because he kind of stood still when he preached, whereas other evangelists jumped around all over the place and it was difficult for the camera to follow them.
Graham's ministry, which spans almost the entire second half of the 20th century, sees an evolution in his philosophy as a Christian. Once considered highly conservative, he eventually moves to a position, in his own words, of prayer and discussion. He comes to oppose the violent tactics of anti-abortion and other extreme religious groups. And as an advisor to every American president, from Truman to Clinton, Billy Graham achieves the widest recognition of any religious leader in the country. Religion is not the only subject that spreads quickly through modern communications. The new media of the 20th century brings instant and widespread knowledge of horrendous wars, weapons of mass destruction, and pervasive crimes against humanity. These shake the very foundations of morality. In the final century of the millennium, many Christians return to the origins of their faith in hopes of recovering the simple message of Christ. Evangelical, fundamental, and Pentecostal movements all seek to make sense of the modern world. One more distinctly American movement now appears as the final days unfold in Christianity's second millennium, and it is quite unlike all the others. It sees America not as the promised land, but as a land of slavery and exile. This is the Black Church, and it will produce one of the greatest Christian leaders in modern times.
And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
Then the Lord said to him, "This is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob when I said, I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over into it." Deuteronomy 34:3-5.
When Martin Luther King Jr. invokes this biblical passage, is he not already in the promised land of America? The Great Depression has come and gone, and there is a post-war economic boom the likes of which have never been seen. But King is preaching to a black church, and for his congregation, the promise has not yet been delivered in America. It is a church perhaps best understood in retrospect, by looking back at the story of slavery. The first African slaves that arrive in the New World in the 1600s have little interest in the faith of their masters. All that changes in the 18th century with the Great Awakening. In the egalitarian tradition of Roger Williams and William Penn, big tent revival meetings of the Great Awakening prove highly democratic. The preachers espouse equality in the eyes of God, and some, especially Quakers and Methodists, oppose slavery directly. Slaves convert in significant numbers, and the first black preachers appear. These early slave Christians seize upon the story of Exodus, of the Israelites suffering in bondage in Egypt. God appears to Moses in a burning bush and promises to deliver his people to freedom. Thus, the message of freedom in the promised land forms the core of slave Christianity. It also has the opposite meaning than it has for the other arrivals to the New World.
For whites, Exodus is applied to their own situation. They have come out of the bondage of the old world across the Red Sea of the Atlantic into this land flowing with milk and honey. This is the promised land. For the slaves, that image is reversed. They have been sent into slavery, and America for them is not the promised land, but is the old Egypt, until and unless they too are freed.
For slaves, Christianity becomes a radical faith. Denied freedom to worship, blacks go underground to hold services in secret. Ingenious methods are devised by slaves to announce these meetings. Spirituals become a secret code. Typical is the double meaning given to the song, "Steal Away to Jesus."
I steal away to Jesus would mean not steal away to Jesus, after death, but that there is going to be a prayer meeting tonight, and so it would be through these songs and encoded ways, messages that the slaves would get the word out of a prayer meeting.
The prayers of the slaves seem to be answered in 1865 when the Union triumphs in the Civil War. History, however, will disappoint them.
The failure of Reconstruction and the chaos of that failure and the return of the power in the form of segregation in the South hardened, and as racism itself seemed to increase in the forms of lynchings mounting to epidemic proportions in the late 19th and early 20th century, blacks realized with great force that they still had not entered promised land and had a good ways to go before they would.
As the 19th century ends and the 20th begins, Protestants lead the way into the South. Most black congregations develop among Methodist and Baptist lines. Ministers take it upon themselves to create a better lifestyle for their parishioners. Southern black communities come to expect their churches to pave the way to social justice.
The gut and the maw and the center and the fiber and the impulse and the thrust of the civil rights movement was in the black churches. And when you look at the histories of the movement now and look for the word reverend, it's all over. Reverend Martin Luther King, Reverend Ralph Abernathy, Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, Reverend James Bevel, Reverend Andrew Young.
Halfway through the 20th century, a preacher named for the founder of the Protestant movement emerges. Martin Luther King Jr. galvanizes black and white alike on the quest for true equality. He does so through an ingenious appeal that combines the ideals of the American Constitution and Christianity, both of which become the moral backbone of the civil rights movement.
King very consciously draws upon both of these traditions in trying to argue that the black freedom struggle is the fulfillment of the principles that America had been founded on, both in terms of the Jewish and Christian traditions and the civic religious traditions expressed in the Declaration of Independence.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident.
The Civil War had freed the slaves 100 years earlier. Now another war, a conflict in Vietnam, would give King a national stage. As America re-examines its own social fabric, King uses nonviolent protest, pioneered by Gandhi and supported by biblical verse, to expose the social inequities at home. King's enemies resist his message with fury. They frequently resort to beatings, burnings, and bombings. King's famous response to these barbaric actions is nonviolence. Embracing the ideals of Jesus, he invokes the Gospel of Matthew.
It was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist one who is evil. If anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Matthew 5:38.
On April 3rd, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. lands in Memphis, Tennessee, in an ocean of hostility. Just 24 hours later, King is slain. A great voice in Christianity is silenced. Tragically, King is not the only Christian leader in the 20th century who struggles for justice and pays with his life. In South America, a Catholic archbishop named Oscar Romero also takes a stand against social injustice and is cut down. Oddly, his courageous stand is only made possible by a remarkable transformation in the Catholic Church in Rome, a transformation known as Vatican II. In the year 1958, the Catholic Church arrives at a turning point when Pope Pius XII dies. Pius was Pope during the Second World War. While Pope Pius had staunchly opposed communism, he had turned a blind eye to the Nazi annihilation of European Jews. The Vatican now tries to come to terms with a bewildering modern world, a world capable of brutality on an unprecedented scale.
My own sense is that the Holocaust was a devastating blow in a way that these people did not acknowledge and could not express. When the 1950s ended and the Second World War Pope had died, I think there was a sense in everyone's unexpressed consciousness that this wasn't working and that the Church had somehow to come to grips with modernity.
On October 28, 1958, the Conclave of Cardinals elects a new pope. He takes the name of John the 23rd. No one expects more than a transitional papacy, for the new pope is 76 years old. Rarely have expectations been so wrong. Affable, humorous, and worldly, Pope John the 23rd ignites a revolution. Just 55 years after Pope Pius X turned the Church away from modernism, Pope John calls for one of the largest gatherings of bishops and clerics in Church history. It is called the Second Vatican Council, or Vatican II.
The Second Vatican Council opened up the doors of the Roman Catholic Church to the modern world. Having had those doors shut for centuries after the Protestant Reformation and having defined itself against the modern world, it is still going on, making progressive Catholicism today one of the most interesting and amazing and dynamic, complex, heterogeneous movements in the history of Christianity.
In the shadow of the Holocaust, the Church now reaches out to the Jews.
Although Christianity sprang from Judaism, taking from it certain essential elements of its faith and divine worship, the gap dividing them was deepened more and more, to such an extent that Christian and Jew hardly knew each other. After 2,000 years, too often marked by mutual ignorance and frequent confrontation, this declaration provides an opportunity to open or to continue a dialogue with a view to better mutual understanding. Committee for Religious Relations with the Jews, the Vatican.
Although John the 23rd dies in 1963, his spirit remains alive as Vatican II goes on to forge a new order for the Catholic Church. Vatican II continues to produce a wide range of documents that modernize almost every aspect of the Church, from the training of priests to standards for the faithful. Foremost among these is the Council's Declaration of Religious Freedom. For the first time in history, the Church affirms the right of non-Christians to practice the faith of their traditions. The revolutionary changes of Vatican II nearly tear the Catholic Church apart. Deeply conservative cardinals passionately oppose John XXIII's updating and leveling of the church hierarchy. Yet, before his death, the Pope confronted this faction with astonishing candor.
In these modern times, they can see nothing but prevarication and ruin. They behave as though at the time of former consuls everything was a full triumph of the Christian idea in life. We must disagree with these prophets of gloom. Divine providence is leading us to a new order of things. Pope John XXIII, October 11, 1962.
The Second Vatican Council also launches a return to the very roots of Christianity, begun with Jesus 2,000 years earlier, forming and building communities among the poor. The spirit of this new movement is captured in the first words of the Council's final report.
The joy and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of people of our times, particularly of those who are poor, are the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of Christ's followers.
The effects of Vatican II are soon felt all over the world, especially in one of the bastions of Catholicism, Latin America. There, in the 60s and 70s, clergy began a new campaign for social justice and equality. They embraced the cause of the poor in countries ruled by corrupt governments, powerful landowners, and brutal military regimes. The movement comes to be known as liberation theology. Perhaps its most famous partisan is the Salvadoran Archbishop, Oscar Romero.
He was talking about peasants without land and peasants being deprived of the little land that they had. He was talking about military repression of people who protested. He was talking about people coming to church, mindless of what the daily life was doing to other people.
Romero courageously defends the peasants, who agitate for the fundamental rights of free speech and equality before the law. Right-wing groups and the Salvadoran regime respond with terror, bombings, and all-out attacks on the church, murdering priests and their followers in cold blood. On March 24th, 1980, Archbishop Romero begins a memorial mass in the chapel of the hospital where he lives. He begins by reading a passage from the Gospel in which Jesus speaks to the apostles about his approaching death.
Truly I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls to the earth and dies, it remains only a grain. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. John 12:24.
Romero continues his service, encouraging the faithful to be courageous and selfless. Suddenly, shots ring out in the church. A right-wing death squad assassinates the priest. The grain of wheat that was the Archbishop Oscar Romero bears much fruit through the many others who continue the struggle for the basic rights of the poor in Latin America and throughout the world to this day. Across the ocean, another death, the death of a pope, brings change. The year is 1978. Rome's College of Cardinals chooses Karol Joseph Wojtyła, a brilliant, humble priest from Poland, to be the first non-Italian pope in 456 years. Before being named pope, he helped battle communism because, as he himself said, it violated and jeopardized the dignity of the person. Now, as Pope John Paul, he reaches out to Jews and others and apologizes for the Church's past wrongdoings. With 8 languages at his command, he travels the world, bringing a message of peace and reconciliation. In 1999, the Pope declares a Jubilee year for the Catholic Church to mark the end of Christianity's second 1,000 years. He opens the holy door of St. Peter's to usher in Christianity's third millennium. Then, on September 5th, 2000, Pope John Paul issues the Declaration of the Lord Jesus, which comes as a surprise to many. In the Declaration, the Vatican rejects the concept that other religions can be equal to Roman Catholicism. The Declaration repeats Church teachings that non-Christians are in a gravely deficient situation regarding salvation, and that other Christian churches have defects, partly because they do not recognize the primacy of the Pope. And thus, the history of Christianity continues to unfold. In the end, however, what proves remarkable about the faith born with Jesus is not how it changed over 2 millennia, but how, in all its variations, its essence would remain the same.
After 2,000 years, Christianity shows a remarkable enduring power. And so I think in 2,500 years, in the year 2,500, nobody's going to be saying, whatever happened to it? Well, it'll be there. Maybe in changed ways, but it's not a fragile thing.
Perhaps the ongoing power of Christianity lies not in the fleeting trappings of the material world, but in the enduring, the lasting world of the Spirit.
Life is certainly not about just amassing as many relics or amassing as many fortunes as you can, that there are deeper issues and indeed things that will satisfy your soul. And as a Christian, I believe that what ultimately satisfies your soul is God.
Some take comfort in family, others in the things money can buy. The words of a long-ago teacher from Nazareth resonate and suggest that belief in something larger than humanity may finally lead to belief in the transcendence, the very future of humanity itself.
And Jesus said unto them, If you have faith as a grain of mustard seed, you shall say unto this mountain, Remove hence to yonder place, and it shall remove, and nothing shall be impossible unto you. Matthew 17:20.
To lumen, to splendor patris, to spec per somnium. tende quas fundam precare.